The year is 1934. The air in California's Central Valley is a tangible thing, a thick ochre veil of dust stirred by a wind that offers no relief from the relentless sun. The camera pans slowly over an immense, parched landscape where rows of grapevines stretch toward a hazy horizon, looking more like skeletal remains than living plants. This is the domain of Mr. Crawford, a kingdom of cracked earth and whispered desperation, where the Great Depression has etched lines of hardship onto every face. The dominant sound is the sigh of the hot wind, a constant mournful breath carrying the scent of dry soil and the distant rhythmic clang of metal on rock. It is a world that measures a man by the sweat on his brow and the strength in his back, a place that seems determined to break anything that does not bend to its will. The light is harsh, bleaching the color from the sky and casting sharp, unforgiving shadows that offer no sanctuary. Amidst the rows, a figure moves with a quiet grace that seems alien to this environment. This is Kenji Tanaka. At 28, he is slighter than the other men, his frame not, built for the brute force this land demands. The camera closes in on his hands as they gently cup a yellowing vine leaf. They are calloused from labor yet meticulously clean, a stark contrast to the grimy, cracked hands of the men who work nearby. His gaze is deep and analytical, not just looking at the plant but seemingly listening to it, searching for a secret language in its wilting form. He moves with a discipline that is almost monastic, each action precise, economical, and imbued with a reverence that the other farmhands mistake for weakness. In the oppressive heat, surrounded by the grunts and shouts of others, Kenji exists in a self-contained bubble of intense, silent focus. His solitude is not just physical. A wider shot reveals the foreman, Hank, a burly man with a perpetual sneer, watching Kenji from a distance. Hank mutters something to another worker, and they share a gruff laugh. The word gardener drifts on the wind, a nickname meant to mock Kenji's delicate methods and slender build. Kenji hears it, the camera catching the barest flicker in his eyes, but his expression remains a placid mask. This is gaman, the art of enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. He knows he is an outsider, a curiosity viewed with a mixture of suspicion and scorn. To them, his careful observation is wasted time, his gentle touch a sign of frailty. He straightens his back, the sun beating down on his straw hat, and continues his work, the silent judgment of the others, a constant invisible weight upon his shoulders. At midday, the work bell clangs, a welcome reprieve. The men collapse in the scant shade, tearing into their lunches with a raw hunger. Kenji walks to a secluded spot under a lone, struggling oak tree. He kneels, untying a cloth to reveal a simple bento box. The camera lingers on the contents, a perfect mound of white rice, a sliver of pickled radish, and a small piece of salted fish, all arranged with an artistry that defies their humble surroundings. This small box, prepared by his wife Yumi, is his anchor, a daily reminder of his culture, his home, and the quiet strength that sustains him. As he eats, his eyes are drawn to a desolate slope in the distance, a patch of land so scorched and barren it is known as the graveyard. 4 vines. A deep, unreadable emotion crosses his face, the weight of a promise made to his father across an ocean to turn this very kind of barren earth into gold. His story is one of thousands, a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a narrative of dreams carried in calloused hands to a new and often unwelcoming shore. These silent struggles are woven into the fabric of nations, built by those who sought a better life against impossible odds. We'd love to know from which part of the world you are watching this story unfold. Before we continue, write in the comments the country and city you are from. Let us know if a story of quiet perseverance like Kenji's resonates with you, for it is in these shared human experiences that we find our deepest connections, bridging continents and generations through the universal language of hope and hardship. The sun begins its slow descent, painting the dusty sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. The workday is over. Kenji meticulously cleans his tools, his movements unhurried despite the ache in his muscles. He stands for a moment, his silhouette a dark, slender line against the vast fading light. He looks one last time at the endless rows of vines, his gaze then shifting back to that dead hill, the symbol of his impossible ambition. The narrator's voice emerges, soft and somber. He walked home under the twilight sky, the dust of the Central Valley clinging to him like a second skin. The rhythm of his days was his shield, the profound silence his only true companion. But on that morning, as the first rays of sun had pierced the haze, he did not yet know what was about to happen. The next day, something would change forever. The walk home was a pilgrimage through shades of brown and grey. The workers' encampment was a collection of identical, hastily constructed shacks that seemed to sag under the weight of the sky, their unpainted wood weathered to the colour of bone. But crossing the threshold of Kenji's dwelling was like stepping into another world. The air inside was cool and smelled of cedar and steamed rice. Yumi, his wife, moved with a quiet efficiency that transformed the small space into a sanctuary of order and peace. A simple scroll painting of a mountain stream hung on one wall, and a single perfect camellia floated in a bowl of water on a low table. Here, amidst the dust and poverty of a foreign land, they maintained a fragile, beautiful piece of Japan. This small, meticulously kept home was their fortress, a silent testament to a dignity that the fields could not strip away. As Yumi prepared the evening meal, Kenji's mind drifted across the vast ocean, back to the impossible green of Kumamoto. He saw his father, not as an old man, but strong and vital, standing waist-deep in a rice paddy that shimmered like a sheet of jade. He remembered the feel of the rich, dark mud between his toes, a soil that gave life generously. The memory of his father's calloused hand on his shoulder as he stood on the deck of the ship was as real as the ache in his own back. The words spoken then were not a suggestion, but a sacred charge, a weight he carried every single day. "Honor our name," his father had said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Turn barren earth into gold." That promise was the compass of his soul, guiding him through the endless, unforgiving rows of California dust. They ate in a comfortable silence, a language understood only by two people who shared a single heart. Yumi did not need to ask about his day. She saw it in the way his shoulders were set, in the deep exhaustion that settled behind his eyes. She refilled his teacup with a graceful, practiced motion, her presence a source of unspoken strength. In her quiet gaze he found not pity, but an unwavering belief that mirrored the promise he had made. She was the keeper of their traditions, the anchor that held him steady in the turbulent waters of this new life. Her unwavering support was the invisible foundation upon which he built his resolve, a gentle but powerful force that reminded him of who he was and the legacy he was honor-bound to uphold. This shared quiet was more restorative than any words of encouragement could ever be. The next evening, while mending a fishing net, he spoke with Mr. Sato, an elder in the Issei community, whose face was a roadmap of hardship and resignation. Sato's eyes held the weariness of a man who had fought too many losing battles. "You think too." "Much, Tanaka-san," the old man said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "You look at the vines as if they hold the secrets of the gods. They are just plants. Mr. Crawford sees us as tools. A good tool does its job quietly and does not dream of becoming the carpenter." His words were meant as kind advice, a shield forged from years of enduring prejudice. He was urging Kenji to adopt the path of invisibility, to keep his head down and survive. Kenji listened respectfully, bowing his head, but inside a quiet rebellion stirred. Survival was not enough. He had to honor the promise. Later that night, long after Yumi was asleep, Kenji sat by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp. In his hands was a worn textbook on American agronomy, its pages filled with scientific terms he painstakingly translated in his mind. The lamp cast a small defiant circle of light in the profound darkness, a perfect metaphor for his solitary quest. He was a bridge between two worlds, his fingers tracing the English words describing soil composition, while his mind recalled his grandfather's teachings about listening to the wind and watching the patterns of insects. He filled the margins with neat Japanese characters, connecting modern science with ancestral wisdom. This small flame was his hope, his private university, his silent vow that knowledge, not just brute force, would be the key to unlocking the Earth's secrets. A week later, a sickness began to creep through the vineyard. It started on the western slope, the leaves on the vines turning a sickly, mottled yellow before curling in on themselves and dying. The blight, fueled by the relentless drought, spread with terrifying speed. A wave of quiet panic rippled through the workforce. The grunts and jokes in the fields were replaced by worried murmurs and anxious glances toward the sky, which offered no rain. Mr. Crawford rode through the rows on his horse, his face a thundercloud of frustration. He saw the dying vines not as a natural tragedy, but as a failure of labor, a direct assault on his profits. His gaze swept over the workers, cold and accusatory, searching not for a solution, but for someone to blame. It was Hank who planted the seed. He was heard muttering to Crawford that the western slope was cursed, a graveyard for vines that had failed 3 times before. The next morning, Kenji was summoned. He stood before Crawford and the foreman, a slight figure against the vast, dying landscape. With a smirk, Crawford gestured toward the blighted hill. "They say you Japanese are clever with difficult things," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm giving you and your family that slope. Show us what you can do." It was not an opportunity. It was a public execution, a stage set for his failure. Kenji bowed his head to hide the fire in his eyes and accepted. He knew this was a test designed to break him. But what he didn't know was that this cursed ground held the seed of his entire future. The first dawn on the cursed slope felt like a judgment. Kenji stood alone as the sun's early rays cast long, skeletal shadows from the dead stumps of previous failures. The air was still, holding the chill of the night, but he could already feel the promise of the day's oppressive heat. He did not begin with a shovel or a hoe. Instead, he knelt, his calloused but clean fingers sinking into the pale, alkaline soil. He crumbled the hard-pan clay, letting it run through his hands, feeling its texture, its lifelessness. He closed his eyes, listening not to the distant sounds of the main camp stirring, but to the silence of the hill itself. The other workers, gathering their tools below, pointed and muttered. Their laughter, sharp and dismissive, was carried to him on the first morning breeze, a sound as harsh and unwelcoming as the land he now called his own. His methods were a source of constant, open ridicule. While other men attacked the earth with brute force, Kenji's labor was a quiet, deliberate ritual that seemed utterly alien. He spent days not planting but preparing. He hauled buckets of fish scraps from the cannery refuse pile and ash from the camp's communal fire pits, mixing them into a pungent compost that drew flies and scorn in equal measure. Hank, the foreman, rode by one afternoon, reining in his horse and spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Kenji's feet. "Trying to grow fish instead of grapes, gardener?" he sneered, the other men nearby erupting in coarse laughter. Kenji simply bowed his head, a gesture of respect that masked the steel in his spine. He continued his work, the rhythmic scrape of his hoe against the stone-littered ground his only reply, each movement a silent act of defiance against their disbelief. As evening fell, casting the valley in a soft, forgiving light, Yumi would join him. Her workday in the packing sheds was just as long and grueling, yet she came to the barren slope without a word of complaint. Together, under the rising moon, they worked as one. She held the lantern while he meticulously carved small, fan-shaped swales into the hillside, a technique adapted from the terraced rice paddies of their homeland, designed to catch and hold every precious drop of water. Their shared silence was a world of its own, a sanctuary built of mutual understanding and unwavering resolve. They were two small figures against an immense, indifferent landscape, their lantern a tiny star of hope in the vast darkness. Their partnership was a quiet testament to a strength the other workers, in their loud and lonely masculinity, could never comprehend. Mr. Sato watched him from the edge of the encampment, his wrinkled face a mask of weary concern. He had seen this kind of fire in young men before, and he had seen how this land extinguished it. To him, Kenji's tireless efforts were not a display of admirable spirit, but a dangerous form of pride, a refusal to accept the unwritten rules of survival. He saw the meticulous rows, the strange-smelling soil, the empty-looking pruned vines, and he saw only a prelude to heartbreak. He feared for the young man, for his wife, and for the shame that failure would bring upon them all. This was not Japan, where diligence was a virtue in itself. Here, results were the only currency, and this hill, this graveyard of vines, had never paid its debts. Sato turned away, a silent prayer on his lips for Kenji to learn humility before the land taught it to him in its cruelest fashion. Weeks bled into a month, and the visual evidence seemed to confirm everyone's predictions. While the main vineyards, under Crawford's conventional methods, were a chaotic but thick green, Kenji's slope looked stark and barren. His severe pruning had left the vines looking like gnarled, skeletal hands reaching from the pale earth, with only small tufts of new leaves. It looked clean, orderly, but profoundly empty. Mr. Crawford made a point of riding his horse along the base of the hill, a theatrical inspection for all to see. He would pause, gaze up at the sparse-looking plot, and a slow, knowing smirk would spread across his face before he shook his head and rode on. His silent public judgment was more damning than any verbal condemnation. It declared Kenji's experiment a failure before a single grape had even formed. The weight of their scorn was immense, but it was nothing compared to the crushing fear of dishonoring his ancestors. At night, in the quiet of their small shack, Kenji would stare at the single scroll painting on the wall, a misty mountain stream from his home province. He would see his father's face not as he last saw him, but as a stern, unyielding judge. The promise he had made to turn barren earth into gold now echoed in his mind as a fool's boast. Each clod of unyielding clay, each whisper of mockery on the wind, felt like a personal failure, a stain on the family name he had sworn to uphold. This was his great, silent conflict, not against the land or the other men, but against the spectre of his own inadequacy, the terrifying possibility that he was not worthy of the legacy he carried. Then the heat came. It was not the usual oppressive warmth of summer, but a malevolent, suffocating wave that descended upon the valley like a plague. The sun became a white, blinding furnace in a bleached sky. The air did not move. It shimmered and baked. On the main vineyard, the dense foliage of the vines provided some measure of shade for the developing fruit. But on Kenji's hill, his severely pruned plants stood exposed. The small, tender leaves, which he had so carefully cultivated, began to curl at the edges, turning a sickly yellow-brown as if scorched by a flame. The hardpan clay, which he had worked so hard to enrich, baked into a cracked, impenetrable crust that repelled what little moisture remained. The other workers stopped to point, their whispers turning to certainties. The gardener's folly was complete. He was killing the very plants he had tried to save. At dusk, Kenji stood alone amidst the wilting rows. The day's heat radiated from the ground in waves, and the wind, when it finally stirred, was like the breath of an oven. He walked slowly, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He reached out and touched a leaf on the vine he had considered his strongest. It was brittle, and as his fingers brushed against it, the leaf disintegrated into brown dust. The camera focuses on his face, the composed mask of gammon finally cracking. A deep, profound exhaustion settled in his eyes, a flicker of utter despair. He had followed the wisdom of his grandfather, applied the knowledge from his books, and poured his very soul into this earth, and the earth had answered with death. He sank to his knees, the dust of his failure coating his hands. In that moment, he felt the full crushing weight of his shame. He did not return to the main camp with the others. Instead, Kenji walked back to his small shack, each step a monumental effort against the gravity of his failure. Yumi was waiting, her silhouette framed in the doorway. She saw the answer in the slump of his shoulders and the emptiness in his gaze before he was close enough to speak. No words were exchanged as he entered. He washed his hands at the basin, the water turning grey with the dust of the dead vines, a symbolic cleansing that brought no relief. He sat at the low table, the untouched bowl of rice before him, a monument to a hunger he no longer felt. The silence in the room was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound, all hope, all air. Yumi moved around him, her presence a quiet ache, her own unspoken sorrow a mirror of his own profound defeat. That night, a rare summer rain began to fall. It was not the violent, life-giving torrent the valley desperately needed, but a slow, melancholic drizzle that tapped against the tin roof with a rhythm like a funeral drum. Kenji lay awake in the darkness, listening. Each soft patter was a reminder of the water he had begged the sky for, now arriving too late, a cruel postscript to his failure. The sound seeped into the shack, filling the space with a damp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He closed his eyes and saw the green, impossibly vibrant rice paddies of Kumamoto under a generous, loving rain. He saw his father's proud smile. The contrast was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting blade of shame that left him breathless in the suffocating dark, the sound of the weeping sky his only companion. In the grey, pre-dawn light, Yumi rose without a sound. She did not light the lamp, respecting the darkness he had wrapped around himself. Instead, she brought him a small, chipped ceramic cup containing a sprig of mint from her tiny window garden, its faint, clean scent a fragile offering against the weight of his despair. He did not take it. He watched her move, a graceful shadow in the gloom, her every action imbued with a dignity he felt he had lost forever. Her unwavering faith in him, once his greatest source of strength, now felt like an unbearable burden. He had not only failed his ancestors and himself, he had failed this woman who had crossed an ocean for his dream. The rain continued its steady, mournful rhythm, washing the world outside clean while leaving him stained with the indelible mark of his own inadequacy. Hours later, long after the rain had softened to a mist, Kenji moved to a small wooden chest in the corner. From it he retrieved a kiribako, a Paulownia wood box that held his most precious connections to home. He slowly lifted the lid, revealing a stack of letters tied with a simple ribbon and a small smooth riverstone his mother had given him for luck. He untied the ribbon and took out the last letter from his father. The paper was worn thin along the folds, the ink slightly blurred. He didn't read the familiar words of encouragement and honor. They would have felt like hot coals on his soul. He simply stared at the elegant, sweeping characters of his family name, a name he felt he had now tarnished. The letter was no longer a source of inspiration, but an artifact of a promise he could not keep. His gaze then shifted to the worn agronomy textbook lying on the table, its cover faded from the sun. He ran a finger over the title, the English words feeling foreign and mocking. The pages inside, filled with his meticulous notes in Japanese, his careful diagrams, and his passionate attempts to bridge two worlds of knowledge, now seemed like a monument to his own hubris. He had believed that his intellect, his discipline, his unique blend of tradition and science could tame this brutal, indifferent land. He had thought he could make the earth listen. The foreman's sneering nickname, Gardener, now echoed in his mind, not as an insult, but as a stark and accurate assessment of his foolishness. He had been a child playing in the dirt, pretending to understand the profound and unforgiving language of nature. As the morning light finally broke through the thinning clouds, something inside him settled. The tempest of shame and despair had raged through the night and had now exhausted itself, leaving behind a cold, clear and unyielding calm. He would not beg Mr. Crawford for another chance. He would not explain his methods to the mocking faces of the other workers. He would not even look to the sky for a sign. He would simply return to the hill. He would clear the dead vines. He would tend to the soil. His work, and his work alone, would be his only prayer and his only confession. He would no longer seek to prove his worth to anyone but the land itself. This silent decision, forged in the depths of his darkest night, was a vow far stronger than any words he had ever spoken. He returned to the slope at dawn, a solitary figure moving through the damp, grey mist that clung to the valley floor. The rain had washed the dust from the air, and the world seemed muted, holding its breath. The other workers, gathering their tools for the main fields, watched him go, their usual mockery replaced by a confused silence. They expected to see a man broken, but Kenji's movements were imbued with a new kind of purpose, a serene, almost chilling deliberation. He did not carry a shovel to uproot the dead. Instead, he knelt, his hands sinking into the damp, softened earth. He was no longer a farmer trying to impose his will upon the land. He was a scholar, a physician, listening for a faint pulse beneath the surface, his entire being focused on understanding the language of its silent, painful history. His failure had not been an end, but a violent, necessary lesson. The kerosene lamp became his most faithful companion, its small, steady flame a beacon in the profound darkness of the shack. Night after night, he sat with the agronomy textbook, but his study was transformed. He was no longer just absorbing information, he was dissecting it, challenging it, filtering it through the lens of his recent defeat. He filled a new notebook with diagrams, drawing the shallow, scorched root systems he had pulled from the ground and overlaying them with drawings of his grandfather's terracing techniques. He was forging a new philosophy, a hybrid wisdom born in the crucible of his shame. This was no longer about honoring a promise with blind faith. It was about earning it through relentless analysis and a humility so deep it bordered on reverence. The lamp did not just illuminate the pages, it illuminated a new path forward, one built on the bedrock of his own failure. His labor on the hill became a surgical procedure. With a small, sharp-bladed hoe, he began to systematically break up the hard-pan clay, not everywhere, but in precise, calculated pockets where new life would be planted. It was grueling, repetitive work that sent jarring shocks up his arms, but his movements were economical, almost meditative. Each strike was a question posed to the earth, each shovelful of shattered clay an answer. He discovered that the impenetrable layer was like a shield, preventing water from reaching deep and forcing the roots to spread horizontally, where they were vulnerable to the sun's fury. He was not just digging holes, he was performing an act of liberation, creating channels for water and life to penetrate the unforgiving heart of the hill. He was transforming the very structure of the land, one small deliberate fracture at a time, his quiet persistence a force more powerful than any brute strength. Yumi was the silent witness to this rebirth. She never questioned his new, obsessive focus, nor did she offer words of empty encouragement. Her support was a language of action, a constant, gentle current that sustained him. She ensured his water jug was always full, that his simple meals in the bento box were nourishing, that his worn work clothes were mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was the guardian of the quiet space he needed to think and to heal, maintaining their small shack as a sanctuary of order and peace that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic battle he waged on the slope. In her unwavering presence, he found the freedom to fail again, knowing that the foundation of their life together was built on something far stronger than a successful harvest. Her belief in him was not in his ability to succeed, but in his spirit to endure. He did not replant the same delicate varietals that had perished. Instead, he traded their last small bag of premium rice with a Mexican family for a bundle of cuttings from their own small garden. These were mission grapes, a hardy, thick-skinned variety the large landowners considered inferior, but one that had survived in this valley for generations, brought by the Spanish fathers. Hank and the others saw this as the final confirmation of his madness. "The gardener is planting weeds now," the foreman sneered, the laughter echoing across the fields. Kenji paid them no mind. He treated each cutting as a sacred trust, nestling it into the carefully prepared pockets of broken clay and enriched soil. He was not planting for profit or for praise. He was planting for survival, choosing resilience over reputation, embracing the wisdom of those who, like him, had learned to thrive on the margins. The seasons turned, and the slope began to change. The new vines were not beautiful in the conventional sense. They grew low to the ground, their trunks thick and gnarled, their leaves a deep waxy green that seemed to repel the harshest rays of the sun. Kenji's work continued its quiet, meticulous rhythm. He fashioned a delicate mulch from dried mustard weeds gathered from the roadside, shielding the soil and its precious moisture from evaporation. His fan-shaped swales, once objects of ridicule, now guided the morning dew directly to the roots of each plant. The hill, once a symbol of barren failure, was now a portrait of disciplined survival. It was a clean, orderly, and profoundly strong landscape. The laughter from the main fields slowly subsided, replaced by long, curious stares. A new feeling was taking root in the valley. a grudging, unspoken respect for the silent sower on the hill. As late summer tightened its grip on the valley, a familiar, ominous stillness settled in the air. The sun rose each day as a white, merciless disk in a pale, cloudless sky, baking the landscape until the horizon shimmered with heat. The wind, when it stirred, offered no relief, carrying only the scent of dust and the faint, sweet smell of withering leaves from Mr. Crawford's vast vineyards. Kenji stood on his slope at dusk, the baked earth warm, beneath his feet. He felt the shift, a tension in the atmosphere that was more than just heat. He placed a hand on one of his hardy vines, its leaves cool and firm to the touch. He looked from his small, defiant patch of green to the immense, indifferent sky. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the land's first test had only been a rehearsal. The true trial was about to begin. The heatwave was no longer a trial, it had become a sentence. A week of unrelenting, scorching sun had transformed Mr. Crawford's vast vineyard into a brittle, yellowing testament to nature's indifference. The leaves, once a vibrant canopy, now hung like scorched paper, and the young grapes, deprived of life, shriveled on the vine, turning into hard, bitter pellets. The air was thick with the funereal scent of decay, a sweet, cloying smell that clung to the back of the throat. The usual sounds of labor, the rhythmic snipping of shears, the gruff camaraderie of the workers, had been replaced by a heavy, defeated silence, broken only by the sigh of the hot wind. Mr. Crawford rode through the rows, his face a mask, of stone, but his eyes betrayed a simmering rage born of helplessness. This land, his kingdom, was dying before his very eyes, and there was nothing his power or his money could do to stop it. Then a whisper started, as elusive as a shadow in the midday sun. It began with one of the older Mexican workers, who had taken a long route back to the encampment to check a water pump. He spoke in quiet Spanish to his son, his voice filled with a hushed disbelief about a patch of impossible green on the far slope. The words, "the," drifted, caught by others, and were translated into the broken English of the camp. The gardener's hill, the graveyard for vines. The rumor was met with scorn, dismissed as a heat-induced mirage or a cruel joke. Hank, the foreman, heard it and spat on the ground, declaring it nonsense. But the story persisted, a stubborn seed of curiosity planted in the barren soil of their despair. It was a tale so improbable that it demanded to be seen, a quiet challenge to the ruin that surrounded them. The whisper finally reached Mr. Crawford as he sat on his porch staring at his ledger, as if the numbers themselves could will the vines back to life. Hank approached, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a reluctant, almost sheepish demeanor. He relayed the rumor, careful to frame it as the foolish talk of exhausted men. For a long moment Crawford did not react. He continued to stare at the figures, the silence stretching until it was taut with tension. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he closed the book, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the still air. He rose, his eyes fixed on the distant, sun-bleached slope. He would not indulge in fantasy, but he would not suffer the indignity of being the last to know. He motioned to Hank with a sharp jerk of his head. It was time to put an end to this ridiculous story, to witness the final, pathetic failure of the quiet man on the hill. The procession was a somber one. Crawford on his tall horse, Hank and a half-dozen other workers following on foot, their boots kicking up clouds of pale dust that hung in the air like ghosts. They rounded the base of the hill, their eyes prepared for a scene of desolation that would mirror their own. And then they saw it. The camera pulls back to capture their collective, stunned halt. Before them, rising from the cracked beige earth, was an island of life. Kenji's slope was a tapestry of deep, healthy green, the leaves of his vines waxy and vibrant, seemingly immune to the furnace of the sky. It was not just surviving, it was thriving. The visual shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow, a direct refutation of every law of nature they understood. There, in the heart of a dying valley, was a miracle, and the silence of the men was a form of unwilling prayer. Mr. Crawford dismounted, his movements stiff, mechanical. He walked into the vineyard, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, mulched earth that was so different from the baked clay of his own fields. He ran a hand over a thick, gnarled vine, feeling the life pulsing within it. He lifted a cluster of grapes. They were heavy, cool to the touch, their skins a deep, perfect purple black. He saw the elegant, fan-shaped swales that cradled the base of each plant, a design of profound and simple genius. But the top of the slope he found Kenji. He was not sweating or struggling. He was on one knee, his back to them, calmly tying a stray tendril to its post with a piece of twine. He finished his task, then rose and turned, his face impassive. He met Crawford's gaze, and in the profound silence he offered a slow, deliberate bow of his head, an act not of subservience, but of quiet, unassailable dignity. The moment stretched, thick with the unspoken. Crawford held the heavy bunch of grapes in his hand, the physical proof of his own failure and Kenji's triumph. He looked from the fruit to the man, then to his foreman Hank, whose face was a canvas of raw, humbling disbelief. The other workers stood frozen, their mockery and scorn from months past now a source of deep, burning shame. No one spoke. No words of apology were offered, no praise was given, but the recognition was absolute, more powerful than any speech. It was in the way they lowered their eyes, in the shift of their weight from arrogance to awe. They had come to witness a final humiliation and had instead become unwilling disciples at a master's lesson. In the crushing silence, Kenji's honor was restored, his promise to his father fulfilled not by a declaration, but by the irrefutable evidence of life itself. Without a word, Crawford turned and walked back to his horse. The men parted for him, a silent, respectful corridor. As the sun began its descent, its light softened from a harsh white to a forgiving gold, bathing Kenji's hill in a warm, ethereal glow. The green leaves shimmered, and the dark grapes seemed to hold the last light of the day within them. Kenji stood alone watching them go. He bent down and picked up his hoe, its steel blade gleaming. He did not resume his work. Instead, he walked to the center post of the highest row and leaned the tool against it, the worn wooden handle resting against the sturdy wood of the vine's support. The hoe, an instrument of his solitary, ridiculed labor, now stood as a silent sentinel, a humble monument to a victory won not with force, but with wisdom, patience, and a profound understanding of the earth's quiet heart. Years passed, and the seasons turned with a newfound gentleness. The hill, once a monument to failure, was now the heart of a thriving cooperative, its vines heavy with fruit that set the standard for the entire valley. Kenji, now simply Mr. Tanaka to all, moved through the rows with the slow, deliberate grace of an elder statesman. He no longer worked alone. Beside him were the sons of the men who had once mocked him, their faces earnest and attentive as they listened to his quiet instructions on pruning and soil health. He taught them to read the language of the leaves and to understand the subtle shifts in the wind. The air was no longer thick with dust and scorn, but with the sweet scent of ripening grapes and the low murmur of shared purpose. The divisions of race and origin had blurred, replaced by a common respect for the man who had taught them that the earth gives its greatest gifts not to the strongest arm, but to the most patient hand. One late afternoon, a dusty automobile pulled up to the edge of the vineyard. An elderly Mr. Crawford emerged, his movements stiffened by age, his face softened by time. He walked with Kenji through the rows, the golden light, filtering through the canopy of leaves. There was no talk of business or past grievances. Crawford simply stopped and cupped a heavy, perfect cluster of grapes in his palm, feeling its weight and coolness. "I never thought," he began, his voice raspy, "that this dead piece of ground—" He trailed off, the admission hanging in the quiet air. Kenji merely nodded, plucked a single grape from the bunch, and offered it to him. Crawford accepted it, and as he tasted its profound sweetness, a lifetime of misunderstanding was resolved in that shared silent moment of communion. It was not an apology, but something deeper, an acknowledgement of a wisdom he had been too blind to see. Decades later, the sun cast long, gentle shadows across the hill. Kenji, his hair the color of winter frost, knelt in the rich soil, his movements still precise despite his age. Beside him was his grandson, a boy with the same deep, observant eyes. He was not teaching the child to work, but to see. He pointed to the way a ladybug crawled along a leaf, explaining how it was a guardian of the vine. He showed him how the tendrils reached for the sun, a silent prayer for light. Finally, he picked a single perfect grape, its skin glowing like a dark jewel in the fading light, and placed it in the boy's small hand. "Some will tell you strength is in the arm that fells the tree," Kenji said, his voice a soft, steady whisper. "But true strength, my boy, is in the eyes that teach it to bear fruit." The boy looked from the grape to his grandfather's face, understanding dawning in his gaze. As twilight settled, painting the valley in shades of violet and rose, Kenji stood alone on his hill. He lit a single lantern and placed it on a post, its small, steady flame a familiar beacon against the encroaching dark, a quiet echo of the kerosene lamp that had once been his only ally. His story, like the gnarled vines he so lovingly tended, was a testament to a power found not in shouting but in listening, not in conquering but in understanding. It is a quiet reminder that our greatest triumphs often grow from the soil of our deepest failures, nurtured by a resilience that refuses to be broken. The strongest seed isn't the one that falls on the richest soil, but the one that learns to blossom where no one believed it could. If this story of silent honor has touched your heart, subscribe and share it so that more voices of quiet perseverance can be heard.